All right, so you've sent over some really fascinating research on how the food we eat can impact our mental well-being, which I've got to say, I find kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible stuff.
So you flagged this one study on fermented foods and anxiety, which I'm super curious about.
Yeah, that one's really interesting.
But before we dive into that,
Okay.
can we talk a little bit about the gut-brain connection? Because I feel like a lot of people listening, like me, hear that phrase and they kind of get the gist, but we need you to like break it down for us.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
really, how can the bacteria in our gut actually talk to our brains? It seems kind of crazy when you really think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable. We often think about our brains as like the command center,
Right,
right?
like calling all the shots.
Exactly. The brain is the boss, and the rest of the body just follows orders.
Yeah.
But the gut-brain axis, it kind of throws a wrench in that whole idea.
So it's not just a one-way street where our brains are like, hey, stomach, digest this. It's a two-way conversation happening down there.
Exactly. It's a full-blown dialogue.
What kind of messages are they even sending back and forth?
So think of your gut microbiome, which is basically just all the trillions of bacteria living in your gut.
Okay.
Think of it like a bustling city, right?
Yeah.
With all these bacteria hard at work, breaking down your food, producing all sorts of byproducts. And some of these byproducts, like short-chain fatty acids, they act like little messengers.
Okay.
They can actually influence everything from inflammation to brain signaling.
Short-chain fatty acids. Okay, that sounds pretty technical. What are they actually doing in our brains?
So they're like, I don't know, tiny traffic controllers up in your brain, influencing how information flows along your neurons.
Interesting.
Like one specific type called butyrate, it's been linked to, get this, improved memory and reduced anxiety in some studies.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So basically what we're feeding those bacteria in our gut, which, by the way, is totally determined by the foods that we're eating,
Totally.
that can actually impact how well our brains function, how we respond to stress, everything.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
That's wild.
And it's not just about those short-chain fatty acids either. Remember those fermented foods we were talking about before?
Yes, the study you sent.
Yeah, exactly. Well, some studies are suggesting that they might actually play a role in that whole gut-brain communication, too.
Okay, so tell me more about this fermented food connection. I've got to know if my kimchi habit is doing my brain any good.
Well, fermented foods are full of probiotics, right?
Right.
And those are the beneficial bacteria that can actually change the composition of your gut microbiome.
So like adding more good guys to that city in our gut to keep things running smoothly.
Exactly.
Love it.
And some research that's come out has actually shown that certain strains of probiotics, especially kinds you find in yogurt and fermented foods,
Okay.
they might actually have positive effects on both mood and anxiety symptoms.
Interesting. So you're telling me if I just eat a ton of yogurt and sauerkraut, my anxiety will magically disappear. Is it really that easy?
Oh, I wish it were that simple.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a magic bullet. The research is promising, but honestly, it's still a pretty new area of study. We're really just beginning to understand how complex these interactions are between our gut microbiome and our brains.
Okay, so it's not as easy as just downing a bottle of kombucha and calling it a day. But it does sound like there's a lot of potential here for using fermented foods to support mental well-being, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So what else is exciting you in the world of food and mood?
I think one of the most interesting areas of research is looking at the role of inflammation in all of this.
Okay.
Because chronic inflammation, which we know can be influenced by diet, has been linked to a whole bunch of different mental health conditions, even things like depression.
Inflammation. So like when you sprain your ankle and it swells up,
Yeah, exactly.
what does that have to do with our brains?
It's a good question. And it might seem kind of weird to think about inflammation happening in our brains because we usually think about it in the context of injuries.
Right.
But inflammation can actually happen on this low-grade level throughout our bodies, our brains included.
Okay.
And it's this chronic low-grade inflammation that can really mess with our brain function. It
Yeah.
can even contribute to those mood disorders we were just talking about.
Wow. So wait, are you saying that what we eat can actually impact the amount of inflammation in our brains?
Yep, pretty much. Some foods, especially those that are really high in processed fats, sugar, refined carbs,
The usual suspects.
exactly, they can actually make inflammation worse. And on the flip side, there are also plenty of foods that can actually help fight inflammation.
Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this straight. We have this gut-brain communication superhighway happening in our bodies.
Yeah.
And the foods that we're choosing are basically deciding whether we're paving a nice smooth road for all that communication or if we're throwing up roadblocks in the form of inflammation.
You got it.
It sounds like choosing the right building materials is pretty important here.
It's essential.
So we're talking about picking out the right materials to build that smooth road. But where do we even start? I mean, this feels like a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, it definitely can feel overwhelming. There's so many different things to think about.
Right.
But I think a good place to start is actually with that research that you sent over,
Yeah.
the one about the mind diet and cognitive decline,
Oh.
because it's a really great example of how even some pretty simple dietary changes can make a really big difference for your brain health.
Right. And that one really caught my eye, I've got to say. I mean, I think a lot of us are looking for ways to keep our brains firing on all cylinders, as we get older especially. And that study basically found that following the mind diet could help slow down age-related cognitive decline, even in people who don't develop Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly.
It was pretty amazing.
And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the mind diet is that it really focuses on foods that have been shown to specifically protect brain health.
Okay, so like brain-boosting superheroes.
Exactly.
Sign me up. Tell me what's on the menu.
Well, leafy greens, for one. They're definitely an all-star. They're packed with all these amazing nutrients, things like folate, vitamin K, antioxidants, and they've all been linked to better brain function as we age.
Okay, so more leafy greens. Got it. What else is on the A-team of the Mindy diet?
Berries are another really important one, especially blueberries. They're full of these things called anthocyanins, which are basically just these powerful antioxidants that might actually help to protect our brains from something called oxidative stress, which has been linked to cognitive decline.
Okay, I'm writing all this down. So leafy greens, blueberries, anything else?
You'll definitely want to add some nuts in there too, especially walnuts. They're a really good source of those omega-3 fatty acids that we hear so much about, particularly DHA, which is super important.
Omega-3s. I knew we couldn't talk about brain-boosting foods without talking about fish, right?
Definitely not. We've got to talk about fatty fish,
Right.
like salmon
Yeah.
or mackerel, sardines, things like that.
They're like swimming in omega-3s, right?
Oh, they are loaded. And there's actually a growing amount of research that suggests those fats are really essential for optimal brain health throughout our entire lives.
And you mentioned earlier that inflammation can play a role in things like mood disorders.
Yeah.
Does that apply to cognitive decline as well?
That is such a good question, and it actually does. Chronic inflammation is thought to be one of the main culprits behind lots of chronic diseases, including cognitive decline.
Okay.
And guess what? Omega-3 fatty acids also have some pretty amazing anti-inflammatory properties, which means they can actually help to protect our brains from that damage.
So omega-3s, they're like the superheroes of brain food, fighting off inflammation, keeping everything running smoothly. Amazing. I need to stock up.
Right. It's like a wonder drug. But, it's not just about adding a few quote-unquote superfoods here and there.
Right.
It's really more about looking at your overall dietary pattern, your big picture way of eating. And the Mind Diet actually emphasizes a few other really key things. For example, it actually recommends limiting your intake of saturated and trans fats, which have been linked to an increased risk of both inflammation and cognitive decline.
So those delicious, tempting fried foods and pastries, those are best left on the, occasional treat list.
Yeah, unfortunately. They're delicious, but moderation is key. And speaking of treats, the Mind Diet also recommends limiting added sugars. So things like sugary drinks and desserts. Because that much sugar can lead to those blood sugar spikes and crashes that we were talking about earlier, which are not good for brain function.
Right, right.
And it can also mess with your mood.
It's amazing, though, how interconnected all of this really is. We're talking about diet and mental well-being here, but it really does tie into, every aspect of our overall health in so many ways.
You're exactly right. It's all connected.
It's holistic, really.
It is. And I think it's important to remember, too, that food is not just about, fueling our bodies physically.
Right.
It can also be a source of mental and emotional nourishment.
That's such a good point. When we actually allow ourselves to enjoy our food, to really savor those flavors, the textures,
Yes.
it can promise so much joy and satisfaction, which is also super important for our overall well-being.
Absolutely. And you know what? That actually brings us to a perfect transition point.
Okay, hit me.
Remember earlier when we were talking about the gut-brain connection
Yeah.
and how, those little bacteria living in our gut can actually send messages and influence our mood?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It turns out that it's a two-way street. Our mental state, specifically stress, can actually impact our gut bacteria too.
Wait, so you're telling me that it's not just what we eat that's affecting those little guys in there, but how stressed out we are?
Exactly. You got it. The gut-brain connection goes both ways. Stress can actually change the composition of our gut microbiome, even its diversity, and that can potentially lead to imbalances that can mess with our mood, our digestion, even our immune system.
Oh, wow. So it's like a vicious cycle almost. Stress impacts our gut, which then impacts our mood, which can lead to more stress. Ugh. It sounds like finding healthy ways to manage that stress is important, not just for, mental health, but for our gut health as well.
Absolutely. And this is actually why I think incorporating mindfulness into our daily lives, even our eating habits, can be so powerful.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so when you say mindful eating, you mean like actually paying attention to our food instead of just like scarfing it down in front of the TV?
Exactly.
Because I'll be honest, I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, I think we all are. It's so easy to fall into that trap of just like mindlessly eating, especially in our busy world. But even just taking a few small steps to be a bit more present when we're eating, to really slow down and savor our food can make a really big difference.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Especially given those articles that you shared with me about the benefits of mindful eating for like emotional eating and stress management.
Right. What did you think of those articles?
Those actually really resonated with me because, to be honest, I know when I'm feeling stressed, I do tend to eat a little more mindlessly, and I definitely reach for more comfort foods, which aren't always the healthiest choices.
Yeah, it's a really common experience.
It is.
Oh, yeah. When we're stressed, our bodies are basically releasing all these hormones like cortisol.
Still hormones.
Exactly. And those hormones can actually drive us to crave those more calorie-dense foods, the ones that are really high in fat and sugar.
So it's like our brain is going into survival mode, craving a quick burst of energy.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
It thinks we need it, but in reality, those foods might make us feel good in the moment, but they're actually probably going to leave us feeling more sluggish and emotionally drained a couple hours later.
So it sounds like we're kind of caught in this loop where we're stressed, so we reach for these comforting foods.
Right?
But then they actually end up making us feel worse in the long run, which just leads to more stress, and then we want more comforting foods, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle for sure.
It's a recipe for disaster. So how do we break free?
Well, that's where mindful eating comes in, because it can really help us to kind of step off that crazy roller coaster. It's really about shifting from that autopilot mode, where we're just kind of zoning out while we're eating, to a place where we're actually aware of what we're eating and how it's making us feel in the moment.
Okay, that makes sense, but how do we actually do that? Like, what are some practical tips for bringing more mindfulness into our eating habits, especially when we're so busy all the time?
You know that article that you sent about the stoplight approach to food choices?
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was a really, really great tool.
Yeah, that one really clicked for me too. It was basically that idea of thinking about foods like a traffic signal.
Exactly. You've got your green light foods, which are the ones that are going to really nourish your body and your brain.
So like all those fruits and vegetables, the whole grains, lean proteins, all that good stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Those are your go-tos.
Okay.
Then you've got your yellow light foods, which are more like those occasional treats that you can enjoy in moderation.
Got it.
And then, of course, you have your red light foods, and those are the ones that we're trying to, limit. Those are the processed snacks, the sugary drinks, all those things that are probably going to send us on that blood sugar roller coaster that we want to avoid.
Yeah, it's such a good visual, that red light, yellow light, green light. I can totally picture myself at the grocery store, like looking at all the packages with my little imaginary traffic signal.
I love that. And I think the other great thing about that approach is that it's not about deprivation, right?
Right.
It's not about having all these strict rules. It's really just about making more conscious choices and finding what that balance looks like for you.
And speaking of balance, I really appreciated that article that you shared about self-compassion.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think it's so easy to be so hard on ourselves, especially when we're trying to, make changes to our eating habits. And I know I'm super guilty of this. Like if I, slip up or I don't stick to my goals perfectly, I tend to just beat myself up about it.
Oh, I totally get it. I think it's something we all struggle with, right? Like we set these really high expectations for ourselves.
Right.
And then when we inevitably don't meet them perfectly, we're like, oh, I'm a failure.
Yeah, exactly. But I love that idea of self-compassion. It's so important, I think, because when we're constantly criticizing ourselves, it's like, what's the point? It's so discouraging, right?
Oh, for sure. And honestly, it can really sabotage our efforts in the long run.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Like we make all this progress and then something happens, like a stressful day at work, or maybe you go to a party and you end up kind of falling back into those old habits. It's so frustrating.
It is frustrating, but honestly, it's totally normal. It's part of being human. I think the key thing to remember is that It's not about being perfect, right?
Hmm.
It's about progress over perfection.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to write that down. Progress over perfection.
Yes, that should be like our new mantra.
I love it. So how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate that self-compassion, especially when it comes to our eating habits?
One practice that I found really, really helpful is try to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer a good friend.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. So imagine for a second that your friend is feeling down because they, ate a whole pint of ice cream after a really tough day.
Yeah.
What would you say to them? Would you tell them that they're a failure, that they totally blew it, they'll never reach their goals?
No, are you kidding? I would never say that to a friend. I would be super supportive and just remind them that, hey, it's okay. Everyone slips up sometimes,
Yeah.
right? It's not the end of the world. It's really more about like, acknowledging it happened and getting back on track, not dwelling on it.
Exactly.
That's
So
a,
the next time you find yourself, being super critical of your food choices, just trying to tap into that same compassion that you would have for your friend.
I love that.
Remind yourself, hey, you're human, you're doing your best, and every day is really a fresh start. Every day is a new opportunity to make choices that support your well-being.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've covered so much ground today, from exploring that amazing connection between our gut and our brain to diving into all those delicious brain-boosting foods. And we've even talked about some really helpful strategies for navigating those tricky areas of stress and emotional eating, which I think we all struggle with from time to time.
It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today.
Likewise.
And I think for me, the biggest takeaway here is that food really is so much more than just fuel for our bodies. It's fuel for our minds, too.
I love that. Food as fuel for both our bodies and our minds. I think that's the perfect note to end on. And for those of you listening, we would love to hear from you. What resonated with you from today's deep dive? What are you going to try incorporating into your own life? Let us know. And until next time, happy eating, everyone. Here's to nourishing your mind, body, and soul.